Well, here we are again. Green and gold, the wind, the occasional bird, and the sun staring in my face. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, today I want to talk about the plan. You like that? The plan. No, not my plan. That doesn't matter. No, not public interest before corporate interests plan. That doesn't matter. This is the plan. No, not the plan on how to get the country out of the COVID-19 restrictions. That keeps changing, as you know. But I'm talking about the plan. The most important plan in Australia today. And that is the plan which has been put together by the Liberal National Party, the people who gave you the COVID-19 vaccination disaster, a plan to be re-elected. And if you think they're not thinking about re-election, they're thinking very seriously about re-election. Because the last election they won the unwinnable election, and this election they think they can win again. And they have an exceptionally important, divisive plan which is based on fear. And that plan involves you. Because ultimately, whether they're elected or re-elected depends on you. Whether you vote, whether you don't vote, whether you vote informal, whether you follow the preference list, whatever, ultimately their authority will be determined by the results of the next election. And the next election will be held most likely in March, April, possibly even May in 2022 for one very good reason, because the country's in the midst of the COVID-19 lockdowns, in the midst of a vaccination panic, and in the midst of control efforts which really cannot keep the virus at bay without vaccination. They need a plan. So what's their plan based on? What is the plan? The plan that Morrison and his cabinets and the Liberal National Party senior people are drawing up. Well, if you keep your eyes on what's happening in the world today, and if you keep your eyes on what's happening in Australian politics, it's quite easy to work out their plan. And their plan is based on fear, it's based on division, it's based on misinformation. These are the central pillars of the coalition's re-election plans. The last election was based on fear and fraud, where the coalition pork-barreled the electorate in order to fall over the line, and obviously misinformation. Now in the wing is Mr. Clive Palmer and his so-called United Australia Party, whatever they call these days. Now Mr. Palmer has a very important part to play in that plan. The advertising has already started, and most likely you've come across some of that advertising. Now he is part and parcel of the coalition's re-election plan. So how does it work? Well, the first thing is fear. Fear of China. Fear of China, generating fear of China and China's intentions in this federal election is fundamental to the Liberal National Party being re-elected. And it's been a very effective strategy, because if you talk to people in Australia, many think they're going to be invaded by the Chinese the next few years. So this fear of China will continue to be stoked. And we've seen it stoked consistently. Now people say, why has the Australian government gone out of its way to poke the Chinese government in the eye over and over again? Well, it's very simple. It's not because they want a trade war with China or they want a war with China. But what they want to do is create the impression that Australian society, the Australian boundaries, the Australian landmass is under direct threat from the Chinese government. I mean, the yellow peril has always been a feature of Australian politics, but currently it's become a dominant feature of Australian politics, and we see conservative politician after conservative and reactionary politician hit the China can over and over and over again. So that's the first thing. The first part of the plan, part A, is generating fear in the community. The second part of the plan is very simple. It's hoping that people forget the COVID-19 shambles that this coalition government has been responsible for. While the rest of the Western world gets on with the task of vaccination, although millions of people in this country wish to be vaccinated and push up the vaccination rate to over 80% to open up the country, this government is so incompetent that it has not been able to obtain a supply of vaccination. And that's unheard of. Considering all the sacrifices that people have made to get to this point, you would think that vaccination would have been first and foremost on their minds. So COVID-19 has a part of that plan. One, they're very keen to keep those people who are unhappy with the COVID-19 restrictions and those people who are protesting across the country on its side, because these are its supporters. Because if you look at the rhetoric and philosophy of the Liberal National Party, it's always been about smaller and smaller and smaller government, turning over the function of government to the private sector. And we've seen that over and over again in the corporatisation, privatisation, globalisation, deregulation agenda, which this government has pursued ad nauseum. So they need to keep their supporters, who are part of the anti-vaccination movement and part of the anti-COVID-19 restriction movement, people who believe they have the right to spread the infection to their family and friends, their colleagues and society in general. I mean, that's what these protests are about. It's nothing about freedom. I remember 20 years ago when we were involved in the struggle against the Commonwealth Government passing legislation during the so-called terrorist threat, which removed most of the freedoms of which we took for granted. I didn't see these people out in the streets, but when it comes to the fact of protecting other people in the community by making a few restrictions, taking a few restrictions seriously, we don't see that. So these are the natural supporters of the Liberal National Party, and it needs these supporters to push it over the line. So we've got the COVID-19 card, we've got the fear card. Now comes what I think is the most evil, that's right, I use the word evil, aspect of the next phase of their plan. Phase 3. And Phase 3 is based on creating division in society. Not the division they've created in the past between, say, Aboriginals and the rest of the population, asylum seekers, refugees and the rest of the population, divisions by people who are supposedly described as leaners, who are on social security benefits, and the rest of the population. I mean, that tactic worked brilliantly at the last election and the election before that. But now they've got a problem. They need to devise a new division with the Intergovernmental Panel pronouncing that we are in the midst of a climate emergency and the time for action is now. And the fact the Liberal National Party is basically a hostage to the fossil fuel industry in this country. They need to mobilise their supporters in the coal regions and the fossil fuel regions of this country. They need people to take their eye off the climate emergency. And in order to do that, they're involved in a campaign to create division between regional Australians and urban Australians. And the National Parties are leading the charge in creating that division, as if the problems that are faced by regional Australians and the problems which are faced by urban Australians are fundamentally different. Ultimately, they're the same. Access to affordable housing, access to decent healthcare, access to government services, access to social security benefits. And in reality, it's regional Australia and rural Australia which are at the back of the train when it comes to access to these services. So instead of overcoming the problems of regional and rural Australia as far as access to healthcare is concerned, as far as access to education is concerned, as far as access to work is concerned, access to decent housing, and the list goes on and on. What this government wants us to think is that somehow, because some people in society, both in regional, rural and urban Australia, want to do something about the climate emergency, that somehow they can exploit this by increasing and creating divisions between rural, regional and urban centres. And at the forefront of this charge is, as you guessed it, the so-called National Party. I mean, the National Party, which delivers victory to the coalition time and time again by maintaining its regional and rural seats. The National Party is not a rural or regional party. It is nothing more the party of agribusiness. It is the party which sponsors and supports the corporatisation of agriculture in this country. Time and time again, we have seen them support legislative initiatives which support agricultural corporations, not family-owned farms, but agricultural corporations. And for far too long, they have been able to ride on the horse that says we are the supporters of regional and rural Australia. If there is one political party in this country which needs to be removed at the next election, it's the National Party. Because the National Party is responsible for stopping Australian governments taking the climate emergency seriously. The National Party, through its pro-corporate agricultural policies, is responsible for ensuring that regional centres, regional towns and cities do not receive the services they should receive. And the National Party is responsible for creating divisions in this country. And let's not forget, it's a coalition government. It's a coalition of the Liberal and National Party. And the Liberal Party could never rule without the support of the National Party. So this is the plan. They have a plan, a big plan, huge plan, based on fear and division, hoping that everybody will forget the COVID-19 shambles that this country has been through over the last 18 months, hoping that everybody will forget the fact that their belligerent attitude towards the Chinese government has caused a lot of issues and will continue to cause a lot of issues in this country for decades to come. Hoping that you will forget the climate emergency and hoping that you will continue to support the fossil fuel industry, irrespective of the consequences for each and every person on this continent. See, COVID-19, the virus, and CO2 emissions have one thing in common. They don't care. They don't care if you live in a rural area or a regional area or an urban area. It doesn't matter. What matters is that action is taken to contain both these problems, that action is taken. So if you want more of the same at the next federal election, believe the plan. Follow their plan. Follow the plan to create fear and division in this society. Follow their plan not to tackle the increasing issue of regional and urban poverty in this country. Follow their plan to ensure that housing affordability becomes such an issue that future generations will never be able to afford to enter the private housing market. Follow their plans to ensure that this country's natural resources, especially those in the ground, continue to be exploited and developed by a handful of corporations who maximise profits for themselves and their major shareholders at the expense of the rest of the community. Follow their plans to ensure that more and more abusive legislation is passed to control the lives of people on social security benefits. I mean, I have to laugh when I hear the word freedom used in the so-called COVID-19 struggle. Struggle to get what freedoms back? Freedom from fear? Freedom from want? Or freedom to do what you like? That's the difference. That is the difference between us and them. We are interested in having real freedoms, having the freedoms to initiate policy, the freedom to initiate legislation through citizens-initiated referendums, the freedom that people don't have to live in poverty in this very rich country, the freedom to ensure that our resources, the profits that are made from our resources, are used to compensate this country's First Nations people and ensure that there are enough services for people in rural and regional Victoria. The freedom not to have to step over homeless people when you enter many of our urban and regional centres. The freedom to know that everybody will have access to a decent education system. The freedom to know that you can actually have access to a decent health care. And the freedom to know that ultimate political authority rests in the hands of the people. Not the state, not the government of the day, but the people. So they have a plan. We have a plan. Their plan is to ensure they're re-elected and they use the power which being in government gives them, the constitutional powers they have to control people, continues ad nauseum. The power to reward their mates in the corporate sector, the power to maintain the status quo. Well, we have a plan. We have a plan to destroy their ability to rule us after May 2022. And ultimately, it depends on you. Not me. Not public interest before corporate interests. Not the government gelded ABC or the corporate-owned media, which will throw their support behind the coalition government, irrespective of their policies. But ultimately, it depends on you. Do you want to live in a country which is racked by fear? Do you want to live in a country which is divided on the basis of artificial division based on misinformation? Do you want to live in a country which is based on the concept of alternative facts, which ignores facts and creates mythical facts in order to justify their existence? Or do you want to move forward as a society and tackle the increasing issues which we face because we have allowed our representatives to be dominated by a small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication? Ultimately, the type of society you live in, how you live, how your children and grandchildren live in the future is determined by the action you are willing to take.